About 2.5 years ago, somehow I got duped into starting CrossFit. About 1.5 years into doing this somewhat strenuous workout routine, I learned that there's actually an official definition for CrossFit. It has 3 parts to it. The first is that it's constantly varied. We never really do the same thing. The second thing is that the movements are called functional movements. And the third is that these constantly varied functional movements are performed at high intensity. I remember the day that I learned this definition. It was right before we started the class, and we started our workout. And in the workout, they had me throwing these 50-pound balls with a handle on them over my head repeatedly. Over and over again. And so after I'm going for a little while and just trying to decide whether I'm going to cry or throw up or just leave, I remembered the second part of the definition, right? That it is functional movements. And in my anger and my frustration and my exhaustion, I said, when on earth in my life am I ever going to need to throw a 50-pound ball over my head? How is this functional? How does this have anything to do with my life? Fast forward a few months, I took a trip to go and visit some priest friends, and we all met up at one of our friends' places in Montana. And one day that we were there, we rented snowmobiles and we went riding through the countryside. And at one point, I found myself falling off. Well, at several points, I found myself falling off. But one particular time, I fell off, and it was in really deep snow, and so the snowmobile kind of turned over. And it was just about upside down, and the gas was leaking out from the gas cap. And so I got up and dusted myself off and tried to turn it over, which I could get it lifted up to where the gas wouldn't leak out, but I couldn't quite lift it up and get on and get out of the snow. And so I had to sit there underneath the snowmobile, holding it up for a few minutes until one of my friends came around and was able to help me to get it out of the snow. And as I was sitting there, I thought, you know what? This CrossFit stuff is actually working. Right? I can do this. I can do the things that I want to do. And I think on that same trip, I realized this when I walked across the airport and got to the gate where I was going to take off from. And I realized that I wasn't panting. Right? I'd walked all the way across the airport with my bags, and I was fine. Right? It is functional fitness. Doesn't seem like it at the time, but it helps me to do the things I want to do. Just this past week, I went, for some unknown reason, to play basketball. I really don't like basketball because I'm not good at it. It makes me very angry. But I went. I wasn't any better than I ever have been. I missed a lot of shots. But I could run up and down the court without passing out. Right? Functional fitness. It doesn't seem like it at the time, but it helps me to do the things that I want to do. It actually works. We find ourselves towards the end of the month of November, approaching the end of the liturgical year. So every year we begin the new church year with Advent. And in the waning days of the church year, we find that we are hearing a lot of apocalyptic readings, right? Readings about the end and how we need to persevere and what's going to happen whenever everything comes to an end. And Jesus tells us in the gospel today that whenever all of these things unfold, whenever all of this starts to happen, that we're going to be persecuted. Right? We're going to be put on trial. Our faith is going to be tested. But he tells us that we aren't to prepare a defense beforehand. Now it's important to realize what he says, right? Don't prepare a defense. He doesn't say don't prepare. There's a difference between preparing a defense and preparing ourselves. And so he wants us to prepare ourselves for the trials that we are going to encounter. And how do we prepare ourselves? Well, we might say it's very similar to CrossFit. Right? That we need to prepare ourselves through a strong spiritual life. Right? By prayer, by going to Mass, by going to confession, by going to adoration, doing penance. Right? All of these things that the church sets before us to develop our spiritual life, we can find ourselves when we're doing them saying, how is this helping me? Right? If you're like me, a lot of times you go to the chapel and you sit there and you say, there is a lot of other places that I would rather be. And I'm really bored. And I don't know how this is helping me. Right? Just like throwing that weight over my head seemed to not have an effect at the moment. It didn't affect my life. It's the same with prayer. Sometimes we feel like it doesn't have an effect on our lives. It may not at that moment, right? But we see it play out later on. And I see this in my own life. Right? That by being committed to prayer, by being committed to Mass, by being committed to confession and adoration and penance every once in a while, I need to get better about that I find it affecting my life. When people come to me and ask me questions, or have a difficult situation that they need help with, or I find myself having to confront someone who's doing wrong, and it's hard, I'm able to do it because of the functional spirituality that I've been putting into practice over and over again. Right? By spending time in prayer, I've not prepared a defense for specific situations, but I've prepared myself to be able to confront anything that comes my way. Right? And so we have to commit ourselves to these functional spiritual practices, even when, especially when, we feel like they aren't making a difference. Right? Because God is preparing us each step of the way for what is going to come down the line. And I think of this most often whenever I encounter someone who is facing an illness, or a loved one is facing an illness or tragedy. And people will often ask, why would God allow this to happen to me? I do all the things I'm supposed to do. Why would God allow this to come to me? And that's a fair question. But something we should look at is, how on earth would we go through this if we didn't do those things? Right? Imagine if we didn't pray and we didn't have a strong faith life. How would we approach an illness? How would we approach a death of a loved one? It'd be much harder. We might fail. We might lose our faith. But if we do these functional spiritual exercises, then when we encounter these difficult moments in our lives, we're able to remain faithful. Right? And we see that it actually works. It actually has an effect on our day-to-day lives. And so we are going to have an opportunity to do one of these spiritual exercises next week. We're going to do one today, right? We're celebrating Mass. Next week, after the 10 o'clock Mass, we're going to have a procession of the Blessed Sacrament from the church over to the chapel. And then we're going to have an afternoon of adoration. And we're doing this because it's the solemnity of Christ the King. Right? We're closing out the liturgical year. And so to recognize that Christ is our King and that we need to do these spiritual exercises, we're going to have this afternoon of adoration. And so I encourage you to take time next Sunday to come and to adore our Lord. Right? To do your spiritual exercises. To gain the strength that you need so that whatever life throws your way, you will be prepared for it and you'll be able to survive and to make it through.